In the middle of the war, the high-ranking Nazi officers devised a plan that seemed impossible to attack the United States directly. It was not propaganda nor an empty threat. It was a real project, conceived in maps, documents, and military calculations. The strategy included submarines crossing the Atlantic, long-range bombers, and a surprise attack on key cities. German engineers were working on weapons capable of reaching the American continent. The objective was clear: to strike the industrial and political heart of the nation that had become the Reich's main enemy. Although the execution never went beyond the preparation phase, the resources and planning revealed to what extent the regime was willing to extend the war beyond Europe. How close was this invasion really? What obstacles prevented the plan from being carried out? And what would have happened if the operation had been possible? The impossible dream: Hitler against the American giant. In the year 1941, Europe was under the dominion of a military machine that had transformed the nature of modern conflict. Adolf Hitler observed from his headquarters a continent he had managed to subdue in less than 2 years. Poland had been occupied in a matter of weeks. France had fallen in the spring of the previous year after barely 6 weeks of fighting, and the Wehrmacht had demonstrated a level of coordination and mobility that surprised all observers. The armoured divisions had crossed the Ardennes, outflanked the French defences, and reached the coast of the English Channel. Denmark and Norway had been occupied. The Netherlands and Belgium had fallen under German control, and the campaigns in Yugoslavia and Greece had concluded with quick and decisive victories. Starting in June of that year, Operation Barbarossa had opened the Eastern Front with the invasion of the Soviet Union. The first months had been marked by a sustained advance of hundreds of kilometers into the interior of Soviet territory. Kiev had been taken, Smolensk was in German hands, and the forces of the Reich were approaching Moscow, Leningrad, and the oil regions of the Caucasus. The territory under German control extended from the North Cape in Norway to the Pyrenees and from the Atlantic to the plains of Ukraine. Only Great Britain resisted, isolated on its islands and dependent on supplies coming from America. The Luftwaffe had attempted to overcome it with continuous bombings, while the submarine warfare in the Atlantic threatened the sea routes that maintained its resistance. In this scenario of military supremacy, Hitler directed part of his attention towards an objective that had been present in his thoughts since the 1920s, the United States. His perception of that nation was not limited to considering it a potential military adversary. America represented something more complex within his worldview and the struggle for future hegemony. Hitler's personal experience in the Great War had shaped this vision. In the summer of 1918, during the Second Battle of the Marne, he had come into contact with American troops. Among them, he remembered 2 soldiers whose appearance matched what he considered the Nordic ideal. From that impression, he built an interpretation of the demographic potential of the United States, convinced that that country had received for generations the most determined Europeans, capable of leaving their lands of origin and settling in a new continent. In that logic, the American population was the result of a selection that had concentrated the descendants of the strongest Europeans in a territory with abundant resources. That combination, reinforced by economic growth and territorial expansion, turned the United States into a reservoir of what Hitler called Aryan blood. The immigration laws in force in that country reinforced, in his opinion, this perception. The Act of 1924 had established strict quotas that reduced the entry of groups coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, limiting the arrival of Jews, Italians, and Slavic peoples, while practically prohibiting Asian immigration. Hitler had praised these measures in his work, published in the 1920s, seeing them as an example of how to preserve the racial composition of a people. To this legislation were added state laws against miscegenation, present in places like Virginia and California, which prohibited marriages between people of different races and imposed the registration of racial affiliation on marriage licenses. Also notable were the segregation provisions in force in the southern United States, known as Jim Crow laws, which kept white and black communities separate in public life. These practices had been the subject of study in Germany during the drafting of the Nuremberg Laws in 1935. Hitler's vision of America was not limited to identifying it as a future threat. He considered that this territory could provide human and material resources to a global reorganization project. The population of European origin The extensive geographical space and the existence of legal precedents of racial classification placed the United States in a particular position within his strategic plans. In public, Hitler insisted on denying any intention of aggression against the American continent. In interviews given to international journalists, he had described the idea of invading it as fanciful, comparing it to an expedition to the moon. However, that rhetoric contrasted with the initiatives already being developed in Germany. Engineers were instructed to design long-range bombers, shipyards were working on oceanic fleet projects, and military planners were analyzing the feasibility of establishing bases in the Atlantic. The contradiction between the official discourse and the ongoing projects reflected a strategic calculation. In 1941, Germany did not have the capacity to confront the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States simultaneously. The war effort on the Eastern Front consumed most of the available resources, and a premature clash with America would have jeopardized the immediate objectives in Europe. However, the long-term perspective remained intact. Hitler was convinced that once dominance over Europe was consolidated and the Soviet Union was defeated, the confrontation with the United States would be inevitable. In his interpretation, there could only be two models of world organization left, that of the Third Reich and that of the American system. The territorial disadvantage compared to the United States, whose space far exceeded the German one, did not seem insurmountable if Europe were unified under a centralized command. With the combined population of the continent and industrial resources extending from the Atlantic to the Urals, Germany believed it could reach the necessary base to sustain a conflict of global reach. In that regard, the United States appeared simultaneously as a rival and as a target. Its control could complete the project of global reordering initiated in Europe. The industrial capacity, natural resources, and population structure made it a key piece within that conception. As the campaign in the East progressed, projects aimed at preparing for a future confrontation with America were not abandoned. They remained active in the shadows as part of a strategy that would only be revealed if the situation in Europe reached the consolidation that Hitler hoped for. Time would tell whether that plan could come to fruition, or if it would remain as one of the many impossible projects that never got beyond the military offices. Plan Z, the Reich Navy that never reached the sea. Plan Z, the Reich Navy that never reached the sea. In January of 1939, Adolf Hitler approved the most ambitious naval program that Germany had conceived up until that moment. The so-called Plan Z envisaged the construction of an oceanic fleet intended to challenge the Royal Navy and ensure the German projection in the Atlantic. The purpose was to turn the Kriegsmarine into a balanced force capable of sustaining operations far from the European coasts. The Great Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, had designed the project with a 10-year time horizon. The shipyards were to produce battleships, aircraft carriers, battlecruisers, heavy and light cruisers, destroyers, and a large submarine force that together would allow rivalry with the British and American navies towards the late 1940s. The strategic foundation lay in that Germany could not aspire to the status of a global power by relying solely on land warfare. Control of ocean routes determined access to raw materials, international trade, and the ability to extend operations to other continents. Without naval supremacy, any expansion was limited to the European sphere. The outbreak of war in September of 1939 completely altered these forecasts. The immediate campaigns on land absorbed the industrial and material resources necessary to sustain large-scale naval production. The construction of surface ships required years of work and enormous quantities of steel, while occupying shipyards indispensable for the manufacture of urgent war material. At the start of the hostilities, the Kriegsmarine had a small number of modern units. The battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, along with the battlecruiser Admiral Graf Spee, represented the most advanced part of its surface fleet. Opposite them, the Royal Navy maintained an overwhelming superiority in number and tonnage. The German ships acted as isolated raiders, with no ability to sustain prolonged engagements against complete squadrons. The Battle of the River Plate in December of 1939 highlighted these limitations. The Admiral Graf Spee had sunk several merchant ships in the South Atlantic, but ended up cornered in Uruguayan waters by British cruisers. Its captain decided to scuttle the ship to avoid its capture. This experience reinforced the perception that large surface ships were too vulnerable within the scope of an oceanic war against a consolidated naval power. In contrast, submarines offered remarkable advantages. Cheaper to produce, with reduced crews and greater ability to operate in secrecy, the U-boats demonstrated effectiveness in attacking British maritime trade. Admiral Karl Dönitz promoted the Wolf Pack tactic, in which several submarines coordinated successive attacks against Allied convoys. The result was that by the end of that first year of war, the emphasis in shipbuilding shifted towards the accelerated production of submarine units, relegating Plan Z to the background. The German strategy was redefined around two objectives: economically isolating Great Britain through submarine warfare and preparing possible operations in the Western Hemisphere. The U-boats progressively extended their patrols into the central Atlantic and began to approach the routes near America. In parallel, the proposal known as the Icarus Plan emerged, which contemplated the occupation of Iceland as an advanced base in the North Atlantic. Its geographical position offered a springboard for long-range air and naval operations, with distances that made it feasible to project attacks towards the east coast of the United States. After the German occupation of Denmark in April of 1940, Iceland, still linked to the Danish crown, appeared as an achievable target. The High Naval Command presented detailed studies on the strategic advantages of controlling the island. Luftwaffe airfields could operate from its territory, and the ports would serve as bases for submarines and surface units. However, the execution of the idea was contingent on the military situation in Western Europe. During the spring of 1940, all resources were allocated to the campaign in France. After the French capitulation, attention shifted to the preparations for the Operation Sea Lion against Great Britain. The United Kingdom reacted quickly to the risk of a German presence in Iceland. In July of 1940, British forces occupied the island preventively, with the objective of blocking any attempt by the Wehrmacht to establish itself there. The United States supported the decision, and in April of 1941 sent troops to relieve the British, months before its formal entry into the war. The North American military presence consolidated the Allied control of the North Atlantic and definitively closed the possibility of Germany using Iceland as a base for transatlantic operations. For Hitler, the Anglo-American occupation of the island constituted proof that the United States was willing to act in defense of its hemispheric security even before an open conflict. The impossibility of executing the Icarus Plan severely limited German options to project force towards America. Meanwhile, the submarine warfare reached a phase of increasing intensity. Between 1940 and 1941, the U-boats sank hundreds of Allied merchant ships, threatening the very survival of Great Britain. This stage, known as the Happy Time, allowed the Kriegsmarine to operate with relative freedom before the anti-submarine defenses were reinforced. The patrols began to extend towards waters near the United States coast, where some submarines attacked ships that were sailing without escort. After the United States entered the war in December of 1941, this offensive transformed into Operation Drumbeat. The U-boats began systematic attacks against commercial shipping on the Atlantic coast of North America and in the Gulf of Mexico. The initial vulnerability of the American defensive system was exposed when sinkings occurred near its own shores. In contrast to these submarine successes, the experience of the large surface ships was negative. The sinking of the battleship Bismarck in May of 1941, after an extensive pursuit in the North Atlantic, convinced Hitler himself that large units were too exposed to operate at a distance. The loss of one of the most modern ships of the Kriegsmarine marked the practical end of ambitions to build a surface fleet comparable to traditional naval powers. The focus on submarine warfare was a response to a pragmatic calculation. Each battleship required years of work and enormous resources, while a submarine could be built in less time and at lower cost, having a considerable impact on enemy traffic. Nevertheless, the original idea of Plan Z did not completely disappear. Hitler remained convinced that, in a later phase of the conflict, it would be necessary to develop an ocean fleet capable of confronting the United States. The German shipyards continued to research advanced designs of long-range submarines. Units were projected capable of operating for long periods in distant waters without the need for resupply. These developments kept alive the expectation of extending the naval war towards the Western Hemisphere in a future that depended on the evolution of the conflict in Europe. The America bomber, Black Wings over Manhattan. In November of 1937, Adolf Hitler visited the Willy Messerschmitt factory in Augsburg. During the tour, the engineer led him to a reserved hangar where there was a model of a bomber of unprecedented dimensions. The aircraft, constructed from wood for display purposes, was conceived as a prototype capable of crossing the Atlantic and reaching American territory. Messerschmitt explained that this design could reach New York, drop its bomb load, and return to Europe. For Hitler, who observed the model with interest, the oceanic distance ceased to be an impossible obstacle. The German leader lacked deep technical knowledge about aeronautics, but the concrete vision of a plane intended to carry the war to the heart of America generated an immediate conviction in him. That encounter transformed an abstract idea into a goal that seemed achievable. The model planted the seed of what, years later, would be consolidated as the America Bomber program. In 1942, the Air Ministry formalized the project through a call to the main manufacturers of the Reich. The technical specifications required an aircraft with sufficient autonomy to cover 11,000 kilometers, capable of carrying between 3 and 5 tons of bombs and returning to its European base after the mission. The strategic purpose was to attack symbolic targets in the United States and demonstrate that no city was beyond German reach. Messerschmitt presented the Me-264, derived from the design that had impressed Hitler. Junkers developed the Ju-390, a larger version of the Ju-290 initially conceived for long-range maritime reconnaissance. Focke-Wulf presented the FW-300, designed by Kurt Tank as the successor to the FW-200 Condor. Daimler-Benz developed experimental proposals with high-power engines and innovative fuselages. The Me-264 was the first to advance to the prototype phase. The design included an elongated fuselage with large-capacity fuel tanks and extensive wings to ensure lift on long flights. 4 BMW engines would provide the necessary power for a transatlantic journey. In December of 1942, the first prototype flew under the command of Karl Bahr. Although the aircraft met initial expectations, tests soon revealed serious problems: engine overheating on long flights, structural deformations in the wings due to the fuel weight, and vibrations that compromised safety. The viability of completing transoceanic missions was limited. The Ju-390 achieved more encouraging results. 2 prototypes were built, and one of them performed a flight in January of 1944 that exceeded 6,000 kilometers. Unconfirmed reports suggest that it came close to the United States coast before returning to Europe, although the available documentation does not allow for definitive corroboration. In any case, the autonomy issues persisted. The central challenge of all the projects was the same: the distance. Completing a journey of 11,000 kilometers required transporting enormous amounts of fuel, which reduced the payload for weaponry. The constant consumption of the engines for more than 12 hours decreased the possibility of conserving enough power for the return. The engineers explored alternative solutions. One of them consisted of refueling the bombers in mid-flight, a technique still experimental in 1943. The initial attempts demonstrated the extreme difficulties of coordinating 2 aircraft at high speed. Another option was to use submarines as refueling stations in the Atlantic. The U-boats would carry fuel on the surface to transfer it to the planes, but the risk of detection and the maritime conditions made the maneuver unfeasible. Configurations known as Mistel or piggyback were also studied. The concept proposed that a large aircraft would carry on its fuselage, another loaded with explosives. Once near the target, the smaller aircraft would separate to attack directly. In some variants, it was planned that the pilot would parachute out before impact. In others, the possibility of suicide missions was considered, similar to those that Japan would later implement in the Pacific. The propaganda value of these projects was central. Hermann Göring insisted that bombing Manhattan would have a devastating psychological effect. The image of explosives falling on New York's skyscrapers was conceived as a demonstration of the Reich's global capacity. Internal ministry documents even mentioned neighborhoods with high Jewish concentration as targets, which directly linked the project with the regime's racial policy. In March of 1943, Colonel Victor von Lossberg presented a concrete proposal. He suggested using a Blohm and Voss 222 seaplane supported by submarines in the Atlantic that would provide fuel and armament. The plan envisioned a route to New York, the execution of a bombing, and returning via a second refueling in the open sea. Although it received initial attention, the mission was postponed due to weather conditions and soon became outdated in the face of improved American defenses and the decline of submarine warfare. By the time discussions were resumed in 1944, the situation had changed. Allied bombers dominated the European sky, fuel shortages restricted even defensive operations, and submarines could no longer operate near America. Transatlantic projects were practically nullified due to lack of resources. Despite that, Hitler ordered to keep the most promising designs as a technical priority. The engineers continued exploring configurations with jet engines whose higher speed and fuel efficiency offered a possible solution. Although they never went beyond the experimental stage, these models represented the persistence of an ambition to demonstrate that the oceanic distance was not an insurmountable limit for modern warfare. The Secret War, Nazi sabotage on American soil. Before the formal entry of the United States into the war, the Nazi regime had already begun to establish support and intelligence networks on American territory. In 1936, the German-American Bund was founded, which functioned as an ideological extension of the National Socialist Party on American soil. With its main headquarters in New York and branches in cities like Chicago and Milwaukee, it organized parades with paramilitary uniforms, youth camps, and public rallies. The most notable act of the Bund took place in February of 1939 at Madison Square Garden, where nearly 20,000 attendees witnessed speeches on a stage adorned with portraits of George Washington alongside flags with swastikas. Although the organization presented itself as a patriotic movement of cultural preservation, the FBI had already begun to monitor it for suspicions of collaboration with agents of the Reich. The Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, used these networks to recruit collaborators among American citizens of German origin. Some were naturalized immigrants, others belonged to second or third generation families. The tasks included gathering information on strategic industries, ports, military movements, and technological advancements. The activity was detected on several occasions. One of the most well-known cases was that of Colonel Fritz Duquesne, whose spy network was dismantled after obtaining classified documents. Undercover footage showed exchanges of sensitive material and was used to alert public opinion. In 1942, Germany decided to move from espionage to direct action through Operation Pastorius. The plan consisted of infiltrating commandos into American territory to destroy industrial facilities and infrastructure. The operation was named in honor of Francis Daniel Pastorius, a German settler in the 17th century in Pennsylvania. The symbolism aimed to reinforce the historical connection between both countries. The first group departed from the port of Lorient aboard the submarine U-202. 4 specially trained agents disembarked at dawn on the 13th of June on a Long Island beach, dressed in German uniforms to invoke the status of prisoners of war in case of immediate capture. After reaching land, they buried explosives and equipment in the sand before changing into civilian clothes. During the operation, they were discovered by a Coast Guard, John Cullen. The leader of the group, George John Dash, attempted to bribe him to avoid a report, but the seaman immediately notified the incident to his superiors. At the same time, a second group landed at Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida, transported by the submarine U-584. In total, 8 agents were to coordinate attacks against aluminum factories, chemical plants, hydroelectric dams, railway networks, and also civilian targets such as Grand Central Station in Manhattan or Macy's store. The intention was to strike at critical infrastructure and symbols of American urban life to generate a strong psychological impact. The plan fell apart due to an unexpected decision. Dash traveled to Washington and voluntarily presented himself at the FB-1 offices. There, he revealed the entire existence of the operation, detailing names, explosives, locations, and attack plans. His motivation was to obtain personal clemency and possible economic benefits. The information allowed the FBI to arrest the rest of the saboteurs in New York and Chicago in a few days. All the material hidden in Long Island and Florida was recovered, including explosives, detonators, and incendiary devices manufactured in Germany. President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered that the detainees be tried by a military tribunal in Washington. The process was carried out in secret, under strict security measures. In August of 1942, 6 of the accused were sentenced to death and executed in the District of Columbia prison. Dash was sentenced to 30 years and Ernest Berger to life imprisonment, both for having collaborated with the authorities. In 1948, the two were released and deported to Germany. The Pastorius case was used as a public demonstration of the American ability to confront enemy espionage. J. Edgar Hoover highlighted the success of the FB-1 in apprehending the saboteurs, although he downplayed the fact that the operation had been mostly neutralized thanks to Dash's defection. Official propaganda turned the episode into an example of national vigilance and determination. The perception of threat extended beyond the United States. Washington pressured Latin American governments to monitor German communities and compile lists of residents suspected of having ties with the Reich. Thousands of people were deported to the United States and held in internment camps, along with American citizens of German descent classified as enemy aliens. It is estimated that there were around 11,000, many of them without evidence of illegal activities. After Pearl Harbor, the German-American Bund was dissolved and its leaders arrested. The organization's records were seized and analyzed, revealing financial connections and direct communications with Berlin. In parallel, the FBI expanded its counterintelligence operations, developing new message interception techniques and surveillance protocols on international communications. The government also promoted awareness campaigns. Movies, documentaries, and posters warned of the possibility of spies everywhere, fostering the idea of permanent citizen surveillance. The population was encouraged to report suspicious activities, creating a climate of alertness that extended throughout the entire war. Subsequent attempts by the Abwehr to introduce agents into United States territory encountered a much more hostile scenario. Coastal patrols were increased, radars were deployed at strategic points, and ports were subjected to stricter controls. Faced with these difficulties, Germany focused its efforts on submarine warfare against maritime traffic in the Atlantic, setting aside the possibility of repeating large-scale infiltration operations. The rocket gamble, the missile that wanted to cross the ocean. In July of 1943, when the Luftwaffe had lost the strategic initiative and the Kriegsmarine saw its capability restricted in the Atlantic, Adolf Hitler received at his Wolf's Lair headquarters 2 engineers who presented him with an unprecedented technological proposal. Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger brought a film showing the launch of a rocket capable of reaching altitudes and speeds never achieved by another human device. The projectile shown in the images would become known as the V-2, the first operational ballistic missile in history. Its ability to fly at supersonic speed and follow a ballistic trajectory made it immune to existing anti-aircraft defenses. The concept represented a technical leap that altered the rules of long-distance warfare. Impressed by the demonstration, Hitler listened to the proposal for a more ambitious development, an intercontinental rocket capable of reaching targets in the United States. The project, designated A9/A10, consisted of a 2-stage system with a range greater than 5,000 kilometers, sufficient to carry an explosive warhead from Europe to the east coast of America. The center of Peenemünde on the Baltic coast became the hub of the experiments. There, workshops, laboratories, and launch ramps operated under strict security measures. British intelligence, however, managed to detect the location through aerial reconnaissance and the collaboration of the Polish resistance. On the night of the 17th to the 18th of August of 1943, the Royal Air Force executed Operation Hydra. Almost 600 bombers dropped more than 1,700 tons of explosives on the complex, destroying facilities, eliminating specialized personnel, and delaying the work for months. The magnitude of the attack forced the production to be moved to underground facilities. Heinrich Himmler took control of the program and launched Project Zement, aimed at digging tunnels in the Austrian Alps to manufacture rockets underground. The chosen location was Ebensee in the Salzkammergut region. Thousands of concentration camp prisoners were sent to carry out the work in extreme conditions: temperatures near the freezing point, high humidity, insufficient ventilation, and minimal rations. The mortality rate was high from the start, with corpses piled up in mass graves and replaced by new contingents brought in on trains. The discipline was under the command of Hans Kammler, an SS officer who enforced a regime of systematic violence. Collective punishments were applied for alleged acts of sabotage or unauthorized breaks. Prisoners were beaten, executed, or attacked by trained dogs in front of the other detainees as a method of intimidation. During the months of greatest activity, more than 8,000 workers died, victims of exhaustion, disease, hunger, accidents, and executions. Despite these conditions, the works managed to progress. In Ebensee, around 7 kilometers of tunnels were dug, with high chambers intended for the assembly of components of the projected A-10 rocket. Mechanical workshops, fuel storage, and spaces for precision machinery were also installed. However, the technical development began to be compromised by the lack of energy resources. Since May of 1944, the Allied air offensive focused on refineries and synthetic fuel plants. German production of liquid fuels dropped by more than 90%, affecting tanks, airplanes, and submarines. Albert Speer informed Hitler that maintaining a rocket program that required large volumes of alcohol and liquid oxygen was impossible. The High Command decided to convert Ebensee to manufacture synthetic fuel instead of intercontinental missiles. The A9/A10 project was officially suspended, although some engineers continued theoretical studies. The preserved plans show a rocket of more than 40 meters, with a first stage that would act as a disposable booster and a second with delta wings to glide towards the target. However, the impact accuracy was minimal since the guidance systems depended on still non-existent technologies like advanced gyroscopes and reliable inertial navigation. The experience with the V-2, on the other hand, did reach the operational phase. Between September of 1944 and March of 1945, nearly 3,000 projectiles were launched against England, Belgium, and France. Although they caused considerable destruction and a strong psychological effect, their military impact was limited by low precision and high production cost. After the war, the program specialists had various destinies. Von Braun was transferred to the United States under Operation Paperclip, along with more than 100 collaborators. First integrated into the Army in Huntsville, Alabama, they later joined NASA, where von Braun was the chief architect of the Saturn V, the rocket that took astronauts to the moon. Dornberger also emigrated to the United States to work in the aerospace industry. Other technicians were captured by the Soviets and taken to their territory to boost the Soviet Union's intercontinental missile program. The knowledge accumulated in Peenemünde and Ebensee was divided among the victorious powers, becoming the foundation of the future space race. Suicidal fantasies, the Reich's kamikazes. In the last months of 1944, the Luftwaffe was undergoing a crisis that had drastically reduced its operational capacity. The German industry, subjected to constant bombings, could no longer sustain the mass production of combat aircraft. The fuel shortage limited even defensive missions, forcing many aircraft to remain grounded. In this scenario of material exhaustion, projects emerged that reflected both the scarcity of resources and the radicalization of tactics conceived to prolong resistance. Kurt Tank, responsible for the Focke-Wulf 191, one of the Reich's most recognized engineers, began collaborating with Daimler-Benz on proposals for bombers that did not require a return to base. The idea consisted of light aircraft powered by jet engines capable of carrying explosive loads to distant targets like New York. The pilots would attempt to eject with parachutes shortly before impact, eliminating the need to reserve fuel for the return and thus increasing the offensive capability. The approach inverted the traditional logic of military aviation, where the preservation of the pilot constituted an essential factor. In January of 1945, Fritz Nallinger, head of development at Daimler-Benz, presented detailed plans to officials of Hermann Göring. The designs revisited the piggyback principle already explored in the Mistel project, where a fighter aircraft was attached to a bomber loaded with explosives. In this new variant, a large-sized aircraft would serve as a platform to transport a smaller one, which would be released near the target to continue as a manned projectile. Human control until the final moment ensured greater precision on impact. The viability of these proposals was supported by the formation of a special unit called Selbstopfer, translated as voluntary sacrifice. This group aimed to recruit pilots willing to carry out attacks without real expectations of survival. German documents record that hundreds of applications were received, mainly from young aviators subjected to intense propaganda or marked by family losses due to Allied bombings. The internal propaganda presented these missions as the ultimate expression of devotion to the Führer and the homeland. Messages were disseminated that extolled the willingness to sacrifice and sought to legitimize the suicide attack as an acceptable tactic, inspired by the Japanese examples in the Pacific. In the spring of 1945, with the Red Army approaching Berlin and the Western forces crossing the Rhine, some volunteers were sent against immediate targets. Among their missions was the destruction of bridges over the Oder River to slow the Soviet advance. The results were limited. The damaged bridges were quickly repaired by enemy engineers, while the human losses among the pilots were total. The tactic, although implemented on several occasions, had no strategic impact and evidenced the desperation of a command without viable alternatives. While these experiments were carried out at the front, in the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's obsessions with large-scale attacks against the United States persisted. According to later testimony by Albert Speer, Hitler repeatedly demanded to see films with scenes of cities on fire, London under bombing, Warsaw in flames, convoys exploding in the Atlantic. During these sessions, he described in detail how he imagined an attack on New York, recounting the fall of skyscrapers engulfed in fire and the reflection of the flames on the ocean. These visions were directly linked to the unfinished projects of the America bomber and the A-9/A-10 intercontinental rocket. Although both programs had been cancelled due to lack of resources, Hitler continued to refer to them as weapons that in the future would change the course of the war. Even in the last days in the Berlin bunker, he spoke of revolutionary means that would alter the military balance. The screening sessions became an obsessive routine. Speer recounted how Hitler found visible satisfaction in the contemplation of urban destruction, an absolute contrast to the reality of a Reich in ruins under constant bombings. The contradiction between his fantasies of raising New York and the inability to defend Berlin reflected the growing distance between aspirations and material possibilities. The Daimler-Benz and Focke-Wulf projects for long-range suicide bombers never surpassed the design phase. The Allied bombings had destroyed the necessary infrastructure to manufacture powerful jet engines, and the required lightweight materials were no longer available. Fuel was allocated exclusively to immediate defensive operations. Despite its practical infeasibility, the preserved documents show that engineers developed innovative solutions. They proposed aerodynamic fuselages to maximize efficiency, simplified navigation systems for transoceanic flights, and separation mechanisms for piggyback configurations. These ideas did not materialize in the Reich, but they would influence later projects in the victorious powers. The suicide missions effectively carried out on the Oder front demonstrated the willingness of some pilots to sacrifice themselves, but also the ineffectiveness of the tactic. The human losses contrasted with marginal tactical results. In the last months of the conflict, delusions of projecting destruction on New York coexisted with the inability to sustain basic operations in Europe, reflecting the regime's final disconnect between fantasy and reality. Could it have happened? The impossible invasion and its hidden legacy. The analysis of German plans to attack the United States reveals a considerable distance between the strategic ambitions of the regime and the material possibilities of implementing them. The projects developed between 1937 and 1945 ranged from transatlantic bombers to intercontinental rockets, but none achieved a level of feasibility that would allow effective operations against United States territory. Logistical limitations constituted the fundamental obstacle. Germany lacked the necessary naval capacity to guarantee secure lines of communication across the Atlantic. Plan Z, conceived to create an ocean fleet comparable to the British one, had been abandoned when hostilities began in favor of a submarine strategy that could harass convoys but not sustain invasions or prolonged force projection. The German submarines demonstrated their initial effectiveness against the Allied merchant navy, but also exposed the vulnerabilities of the German supply lines. As the Allies perfected detection techniques, escort systems, and depth charges, the U-boats progressively lost their operational advantage. Operation Drumbeat showed that it was possible to bring the war to the American coasts, but not to maintain a sustained offensive presence. In the aerial field, the America bomber prototypes faced insurmountable technical problems with the available technology. The Me-264, the Ju-390, and other designs never satisfactorily solved the basic equation of range versus payload. Flights of over 11,000 kilometers required quantities of fuel that drastically reduced the transportable armament, while proposed solutions like aerial refueling or submarine support presented excessive operational risks. Experiments with piggyback configurations and suicide aircraft reflected the desperation to seek alternatives when conventional solutions had failed. Although some German volunteers carried out sacrificial missions against tactical targets on the Eastern Front, the extension of these tactics towards overseas targets required industrial and logistical capabilities that Germany no longer possessed in the last years of the war. The intercontinental rocket program represented the most technically advanced approach, but also the farthest from operational reality. The V-2 demonstrated that Germany could develop functional ballistic missiles, but the A9/A10 design required an industrial and energy infrastructure that far exceeded the available resources. The construction of tunnels like those in Ebensee advanced at a high human cost, but failed to materialize the necessary mass production. The decisive advantage of the United States lay in the combination of industrial capacity, naval control, and technological development. American manufacturing output massively surpassed the German. In 1944, the United States manufactured more than 96,000 aircraft, while Germany barely reached 40,000, many of which were quickly destroyed in combat. The Allied naval supremacy in the Atlantic closed any possibility of German units approaching the American coasts with lasting offensive intentions. The development of the Manhattan Project introduced a factor that Germany never managed to match. When the United States successfully tested the atomic bomb in July of 1945, the gap between German plans and real Allied capability became definitive. Even if Germany had managed to develop operational intercontinental bombers, it lacked weapons of mass destruction that would guarantee decisive strategic effects. The destinations of the main engineers involved in these projects illustrate how the technical knowledge developed during the war was dispersed among the victorious powers. Werner von Braun was transferred to the United States along with more than 100 collaborators through Operation Paperclip. Initially integrated into the Army missile program in Huntsville, Alabama, he later led the development of the Saturn V rocket that transported American astronauts to the Moon in 1969. Walter Dornberger also emigrated to the United States, where he worked on the development of intercontinental missiles for the aerospace industry. His experience with long-range rockets contributed directly to American military programs during the Cold War. Other German specialists were captured by Soviet forces and moved to the Soviet Union, where they participated in the development of that country's space and missile program. In West Germany, figures like Willy Messerschmitt continued working in the aeronautical industry after initial prohibition periods. Although his company could not manufacture airplanes during the first years of the post-war period, it resumed production in the 50s and developed new models that incorporated lessons learned during war projects. Kurt Tank emigrated to Argentina, where he collaborated with the government of Juan Domingo Perón in the development of jet aircraft like the Pulki II. Fritz Nallinger remained in the German automotive industry and became a member of the board of directors of Daimler-Benz in the Federal Republic. His work on high-power engines during the war influenced subsequent developments in both aviation and motor racing. He was awarded the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1954. The most significant legacy of these German projects was their transformation into the technology that defined the confrontation between superpowers during the Cold War. The competition for control of space between the United States and the Soviet Union was greatly fueled by the accumulated knowledge of German engineers during the Third Reich. The concepts developed for the Amerika Rakete provided technical foundations for the intercontinental missiles that would later carry nuclear warheads. The plans for the A9/A10 bore evident conceptual similarities with the intercontinental rockets developed in the subsequent decades. The idea of a projectile capable of crossing oceans and reaching another continent went from being a German aspiration to becoming an operational reality during the 50s and 60s. The Saturn V, with its 110 meters of height, can be considered a direct descendant of those designs originally conceived to bomb New York. However, the fundamental difference lay in the context and purpose of these developments. While the German plans had been born in a framework of total war and racial extermination, the post-war period recycled them as symbols of technological progress and peaceful exploration of space. The same technology that Hitler had envisioned to destroy American cities transformed into the vehicle that took human beings to the moon. The transition from war to space exploration illustrates how technical innovations can transcend their origins to serve completely different purposes. The engineers who had worked on destructive projects during the war applied their knowledge to scientific and national prestige goals during peace. This transformation did not eliminate the ethical questions about the use of knowledge developed through forced labor and massive suffering. The question of whether Germany could have successfully attacked the United States finds an answer in the analysis of capabilities versus aspirations. The projects existed on paper, and some advanced to functional prototypes, but the gap between theoretical design and operational implementation proved insurmountable given the limitations of resources, time, and technological development available during the war.